Hey everyone, today's gonna be a fun one. Excited to be welcomed by two guests today. Brian, I've never said your last name before, but I'm gonna try it. Utesch,
Yes, perfect.
Head of Intelligent Experience Research at Cisco, and Tammi Fitzwater, who leads UX Research and Data Analytics. This is a really cool one for me because I constantly get asked questions about how to demonstrate impact in research and how to really make your mark as a researcher. And this is a new model. We've talked a lot previously about researcher effort score, and this is this is not the res, this is the RAS, because Brian and Tammi are co-authors of the Recommendation Adoption Score Framework we're discussing today. You've probably read the articles on Nielsen Normal Group website. They've partnered with them on this multi-part series about it, with parts 1 and 2 already live. They both hold PhDs and bring decades of combined experience at this work. Brian's background includes 20 years leading UX research teams at organizations like IBM and now Cisco, while Tammi brings deep expertise as a researcher, research scientist, and now research analytics. The framework came out of a pattern they've seen repeatedly. Rigorous research gets delivered, celebrated, and then fails to create actually any change for real users. It gets abandoned. And so what this research adoption score does differently is it's created a way to measure and fix how research actually gets adopted in the enterprise. Before we dive in, if you haven't met me, my name is Ned. I'm co-founder and CEO of Great Question. We're a customer research tool to make it easy to do everything from running recruiting the right people to running all the research methods and sharing the results with the team, used and loved by teams at the likes of Cisco, might have heard of them, Amazon, Intuit, and fast growth companies like Canva and Brex. That's enough about me. I'm going to focus mostly on Brian and Tammi. If you have questions at any time, drop them in the Q&A. We're going to leave time at the end, 5 or 10 minutes at the end, to talk about any questions that you might have. But let's get started. So, Brian and Tammi, you've shared a pretty hot take in the article. Insights don't fix anything. They just describe the problem. Walk us through what you mean by this adoption gap and how you first kind of recognized that it was a systemic issue.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. It really came out of a practical need as a leader of a research team where I didn't want to get into this situation where an executive several layers above me might come to me and ask me, hey, what's your team been doing? And I didn't want to be kind of squishy, say, oh, we're doing great stuff, doing a lot of research reports, working with some teams, and them being left with a very empty kind of response. And I tend to lean more on the quantitative side. And so the goal was really to protect my team, protect the output coming from my team in a way that's quantifiable. So Tammi and I, it was about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, when we started talking about this idea of how do we measure research recommendation adoption. And I think what was really powerful about Tammi and I working together is up until about 3+ years ago, when Tammi joined our organization, Tammi was in academia. I've always worked in industry, and I think that combination of those two perspectives really helped us kind of refine what we were trying to do here in terms of a metric. As you kind of look at where research sits in a larger process of developing products and services, we could try to change the entire dev process, but very impractical, probably not going to work. It's just kind of a big thing to deal with. And so the goal here was to create and inject a metric into the process that we own and that we can use to influence the process, not necessarily change the process. So, this hot take about, around insights and how we tend to call ourselves very insights-led. It's kind of cool to say we create insights. We're an insights team, insights all the time. And I'm not suggesting that we have teams called recommendation teams. That's kind of ridiculous. And in fact, our larger team, into which my team reports, is a research and insights team. So, of course, it makes perfect sense to say such things. But I don't believe that we focus enough on that last step. And so, when you talk about this self-contained unit of value in terms of recommendation, what do we mean by that? So we define it as actionable steps derived from UX research insights that guide product teams in making user-centered decisions. So those can take various forms. They can be large or they can be small. People might ask, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that I did a usability test, I come up with a recommendation to change this widget, and then I see whether it actually makes it into the tool? Yeah, that's one way. Another way is we do strategic discovery research that might be something that influence where the company is going. Well, that's not necessarily going to be represented in the product itself, but it may be represented in the strategy that's articulated in the organization. So there's various ways for us to check the box and say fixed. Could be in the product, could be in the strategy. All that is meant to say that wherever it gets traction, that's what we consider fixed. So the other aspect of that too is that we don't seem to be finishing the swing, or what I call climbing the full ladder of impact. So when we talk about recommendations, I tell my team that when we have a recommendation, it's important to show the chain of evidence that led to that recommendation. So the way we define that is, you start with data that influence findings, findings create insights, insights drive recommendations. And so if we just stop at insights, we're leaving too much up to chance and to interpretation for our stakeholders who receive the insights. And so I don't want to hear somebody, when we report out research, say, that's interesting. I want them to say that's useful or that's valuable. I'll just finish up the answer to this question and say, we oftentimes will talk about what we do in terms of research around you spoke, we listened. I see that phrase happen a lot, but then sometimes you don't hear the third piece of that, which is, and we acted. So you spoke, we listened, and we acted. So it's this difference between knowing and doing guidance versus just insight.
I'm curious, one perception that one attitude that I've heard in the research community, and I'm not a researcher, I'm a product manager. I dress up as a researcher every now and then. Is there, in the industry, or have you heard, there are some people that don't actually want to go as far as recommendations? We provide the insight. It's not our job to provide the recommendation. So it sounds like you're going beyond that to get to recommendation, and then go even further to say, and how many of these are actually adopted? Is that fair?
Completely fair. Yes. And in fact, there's been times in my career where I've stopped at the insight, because you think I've delivered something that's new. I've added some of my intellectual power to the finding that was created from research, and now I've given you this packaged information, right? Now do something with it. I'm going to go do the next thing that's interesting to me. I'm not going to follow up on it. I'm not going to see what happened with it, because frankly, that's not the more interesting or fun part of our jobs. It isn't. Researchers don't live or didn't get their degree or didn't train to track recommendations, but it is a necessary thing to show what actually happens with what we deliver. So yeah, I completely agree that that does happen quite often.
And probably even more so with the pressures of AI as well, that how you need to, where product builders are becoming full stack and, doing some research, doing some data analysis, doing some design, implementing, we need to extend the size of our stack as well, as researchers. I guess in your experience, when you talk about the cost when recommendations don't get adopted, and you kind of reflected a little bit on it from the researchers themselves, right? It's like you're putting them at risk. Mm-hmm. You're kind of protecting them by encouraging them to make sure that their recommendations get adopted. But maybe talk a little bit more about what's the cost to the organization or to users.
Yeah, I'll start with users. So, they continue to experience the pain of things that we already know how to fix. That's kind of the irony of it, is that we've done the research, we know what the problem is, we know what's going to fix it, but then we're holding on to it for some reason. So that's, one of those things that we're looking at in our data is, what's the dwell time of these recommendations in this holding place before they actually see the light of day. From a user perspective, they also kind of get to this learned helplessness stage where they feel like, particularly if they've provided feedback over a set period of time and they don't see it reflect in a new experience or a better experience, they then say, why bother? And I've seen this personally in other places that I've worked, where we've seen quarter after quarter the response rate go down because we have not shown them that what they told us is something that not only did we listen to, but we acted on. So that's one of the things too. And I think that results in lower expectations from our users around either the product, the company, whatever it is we're delivering. Their expectations then go down, and they think, well, I guess this is the best that this team or company can deliver on. So I think it really has a lot of far-reaching impacts. And if you look at the organization's invested perhaps millions of dollars in research headcount. And you may, as an executive, say, hey, I've invested all these millions of dollars. We have these top line success metrics. They're not moving. What are you doing? What's going on? What am I paying for if I'm not getting any benefit out of this research that I'm paying for? So massive perception issues, problems with that, and we don't move from potential energy to kinetic energy. We don't see that translation of value to where it's actually hitting the ground. And to your point around AI, what I want to see, and we're interested in measuring this over time, is that as AI proliferates and researchers are able to do more, at some point in time, researchers may be able to implement and short cycle some of those things so that not only are we creating the insights and the recommendations, but we're acting on them ourselves. So I'd expect that dwell time to go down as the tools become better and researchers and designers are more enabled to act on their own research recommendations.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's going to be critical for researchers in every function, really, to be able to get to a place where they can deploy some change to fix a user problem. In your, I'm going to refer to it as an article because it's called an article in Nielsen Norman Group, but I feel like it's so much more than that. In your framework, use the term research breakage as an analogy to retail inventory. What are the most common ways you've seen recommendations break down between the research readout and what actually ships? Is it people like forgetting them, cherry picking them, disregarding them? I know better, gut instinct, hippos. Like what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, all the above. Tammi, I think you're going to show a chart that kind of illustrates this from a retail perspective, and that's where the term breakage, it's also known as shrink. But what happens from the point where a company or a Walmart, for example, they spend a lot of money, they buy inventory, and by the time it gets to the shelf, the information on what they thought they had in inventory and what's actually on the shelf is different. And what's on the shelf is less than what they ended up paying for. So something got lost in the process. And here I'm showing a couple of examples where we're really trying to move from potential to actual. And if you have any experience with sales, one example around that would be in terms of qualified leads or closed deals, right? So you have all these qualified leads of potential, then you may have slow follow-ups, drops more people out. You may have dropped handoffs, more people drop out. Ownership confusion, more people drop off. And so you get to something far less than what you would have had you dealt with some of those places where things are falling out. Same thing happens with research recommendations. We get things falling out over time. And on the next chart, it kind of shows examples of what happens typically in retail, where you can classify things as external theft or internal theft or process error. Same thing with research recommendations. You might have stakeholders who override it and say, yeah, we're not doing that. It's not consistent with our strategy. We just don't like it. Whatever the reason is, they don't want to do it. Or you might have what we call internal theft. They go with a different solution, or design interprets your recommendation differently than what you intended. And on these 2 points, you may hear about this a little bit later when Tammi goes into it. On the first point, we don't expect, and this is built into our threshold, we do not expect our stakeholders to act on 100% of the recommendations they get. That's not practical. It's not reasonable. So there may be very good reasons. The strategy may change. Who knows? But there may be very good reasons the business decides not to act on something. And we accommodate that. In terms of different solutions, we also accommodate that because we make sure that the researcher is the final say in whether a recommendation has been adopted according to the intent of the recommendation. So if somebody else takes that, designs something completely different, we won't classify that as fixed until we see that it actually addresses the problem. And then the last one around process error, sometimes we just don't have somebody who follows up. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of the best recommendations are usually the ones that we rate high in terms of value or impact, and they cross organizational boundaries. And those are the ones that are really tricky because you may have done the research for a particular stakeholder, and they try to wiggle out of it and say, well, that we have dependencies on other technologies. And you're like, well, that's kind of that's your game to play. Our game is to do the research, do it rigorously, communicate it effectively, and then work with design to make sure the solution is what it should be. But in terms of working the product ownership, that's their job. So what happens in having RAS is it sets up some clear boundaries around what our responsibility is and what our responsibility isn't. And so, that's kind of the explanation of I call it here bleed. It's breakage. It's acknowledging the gap between value and delivery or research and delivery. So it's not necessarily that the entire process is broken. It's just value is bled out. And I think in some ways that's more insidious because I'm sure people on this call have heard, we have a great relationship with our researchers. I've heard those words before. Or we act on what we get from research. Heard that before too. But what do you do with that? How do you quantify that? How do you stop from feeling like you're being gaslit, where people are saying things are happening, but you just feel something's different, and now we're putting a number on that feeling, and that's kind of the essence of what we've created with RAS.
Love that. I'm glad that you addressed. That was one of my follow-on questions. Was like, is it rational to never get to 100% RAS? And I'm sure you're going to go through that as you describe the framework. Before we move on to that, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the framework. The final question I kind of had on more to our breakage is, a lot of it isn't intentional, right? What are the warning signs that tell you that breakage is happening before you even calculate the score? Like, is that just a vibe? Like, Tammi, please.
I love to jump in on that one. I think Brian used a really good word, insidious. It's a great question because I mean, if we really think about what's going on at work, everyone comes to the table with good intentions, right? Our researchers come with good intentions. They're in the business because they want to make life better for the user. Our product owners want to create good products that our users enjoy using. And our engineers and builders want to make good things that people want to use and work well. So at the surface, everything feels like very aligned and everybody feels good intentions and everything looks good. And so breakage is really those like small insidious leaks between the good intention and the outcome. So people have heard about that kind of scenario where I think Brian sort of alluded to this earlier, where you show up to the table to give your readout and you tell everybody about the findings of your study with your insights and hopefully some recommendations. And you hear a lot of, yeah, that's really interesting. We should really do something about that. Let's fix that. But then what actually ends up happening is in the background, the roadmap's probably already locked in for the next several sprint cycles, and other things have already taken priority over this extra readout that happened. And then the things that everyone head nodded about needing to be fixed don't actually make it into the plan. And so no one flat out rejected the research in most cases, and nothing really dramatic happened, but the recommendation just kind of quietly fell out of the system. And if I had to kind of identify like specific warning signs, I'd say one is repetition. So that cycle repeating over and over again, where you give the readout, you identify the problem, and then 6 months later, you do another study, and guess what? The same user problems still exist. And you feel like you're doing Groundhog Day, where you're back in the same room, telling the same people about the same problems, and it's defeating and it's demoralizing for a lot of people. So that would be one warning sign. I would say another one is probably like that fog that you see in the organization where it's not there, everything isn't clear. There's kind of like this mask over everything where there's the communication, there's the head nodding, but there's not a clear owner to things. And so tickets might get created, but they sit in a backlog with no one taking responsibility for them, and there's no timeline associated with them. And because of that unclear fogginess, no momentum happens. And so the recommendations just kind of sit there and die on the vine. And probably the third pattern I would talk about would be what Brian said earlier about enthusiasm over insights, but not recommendations. So people really like to hear about those problems, but when it turns into what's the change and who's going to change it or fix it, then the enthusiasm kind of dies out a little bit. And so when you kind of see any of those patterns, but mostly we see all those patterns at different degrees, then we typically know there's some research breakage happening and you're going to have to measure it.
Love that. As someone that's living in a lot of decks these days, I'd probably add a fourth one there, which is like, if the presentations of what we're working on, the strategy and things like that, aren't leading with the recommendations, or the recommendations imbued in that, at like how we're communicating out to the rest of the organization and driving that roadmap, then maybe that's another one. Let's get into the mechanics. Walk us through exactly how we figure out the RAS.
Okay, well, I like to talk about that, so I'll just keep talking.
Great.
Really at the heart of it, RAS is simple math. It's a percentage, right? So it's basically how many total recommendations do we have and what percentage of them have actually made it to adoption. So at its basic idea, it's very simplistic, but we kind of felt like we needed to do some tweaking to make it more representative of what's actually happening and give fairness to the types of recommendations that are being delivered. So I am going to go ahead, because I'm a visual person. I'm going to share a quick slide. I knew this was going to come up, and it's easier, I think, to talk through the RAS calculation with some visuals. So if we just think about all the recommendations that got communicated out to the product teams, that's our denominator for our percentage. And then we can think of that as what's the potential value that could be delivered. All these recommendations have been delivered, so there's a potential for them to be fixed. And then the numerator is just what's the actual realized value that's been delivered to the user. So we total up the total number of adopted recommendations that have made it into the product. And then we also include committed recommendations. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit, why we did that. We didn't just stop at, okay, it's been adopted. That's, check, that's a number. We decided that not all recommendations are created equal. So some recommendations can be of high value to the user, and they're going to make a very noticeable difference to the user's experience. So we felt like they deserved a boost because they have a higher potential value to the user. So we gave them a 3x multiplier. Then there are some recommendations that are of medium value to the user. And so those are going to get a 2x multiplier. And then we have the recommendations that are kind of more like bells and whistles, those kind of low-hanging fruit. That's a low value recommendation for the user. And so they just count at face value. So you would take the number that have been adopted in each of those categories, multiply them by their multiplier, add it all up. And then we have this little bonus. So if you're working with a team who's got a packed roadmap and they have the intention to put your recommendations into the product, once it's in the roadmap and it's scoped and there's resources available, we're going to give a little boost that it's been committed to. And we're going to give the boost at about 2/3 value. So why are we doing that? Well, we want to sort of reward the researcher, product owner, designer-engineer relationship by saying, if we're all going to say this is important and we're going to make space to make sure that this gets done, let's give a little boost to the RAS score. We do not, just as a note, we do not take the committed recommendations and give them their multiplied value in that part of the equation because they've not made it to the user yet. So you don't get to get that boost in value until you actually deliver that recommendation to the user. So they just get to get that 2/3 boost in the numerator. So once you've done that, you're just applying the simple math. Here's the more complicated formula. We're just doing our multipliers, adding it all up. And then in the denominator, the reason I show this equation is to show if the denominator is the potential value, then those high value recommendations have 3x the value in potential as well. So whatever we're doing to the numerator, we got to do the denominator as well. So we're going to add up that potential value across those 3 recommendation categories. And then we're just going to simply multiply that proportion by 100 to get a percentage. It ends up on a score of 0 to 100. And the higher your RAS score, the better things are in terms of research implementation.
Tammi,
So
would
that's
now
it.
So Tammi, would now be a good time to mention that we're going to release next week a spreadsheet. So for those who want to adopt this, I know some of this may look more complicated than it actually is. What are we doing next week, Tammi, as far as getting that out to people?
Yeah, I believe so. We have 2 team members who are researchers working with Brian that have created this beautiful template in Excel. And so we're just going to share that freely. I believe it's coming out on LinkedIn, and you'll just be able to kind of download it and start using it and start plugging those recommendations in and calculating some RAS for your team.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. That's great. I would appreciate that, because when I look at this, different maths is, I'm more of a words guy than a maths guy, but this is great. And so how do you, when I think about how this is then, sorry, if you've got more, please keep going, but
Yep.
to interrupt is, how do you and your team decide what counts as high versus low and avoid that? Like, I'm thinking about all the arguments that are going to come in here, and I'm sure we're going to talk about a bit more around the resistance, but one is like, how are we doing, what's high and what's low? And then on the other side is the researchers are the one that get to decide, oh yeah, that recommendation has been fulfilled, right? And so that creates some strange incentives as well. So maybe you could talk a bit more about the mechanics there.
Yeah, so that argument, I think that dies a little bit if you focus on the fact that the definition of high, medium, low depends on value to the user. So you get to take opinion about how you feel about that particular recommendation and its importance from your perspective off the table, and just focus on what is it going to do for the user. So in our situation, we deem a high value recommendation something where if the user experiences that, it's going to have a noticeable impact on their experience, where you would see higher task success. You would see greater retention with the product. You would see greater satisfaction values. People are going to notice, and it's going to significantly change the way that experience is in the product. Whereas a medium value recommendation is still going to matter. Maybe it's something that's not related to an action or a feature that they use on a day-to-day basis, but when they do get to that thing, it is going to make a noticeable change to their experience. And then, as I said before, the low value recommendation is like the low hanging fruit. It's polish. It's not going to change the experience on its own. It's just little bells and whistles. So it will improve the product, but not noticeably for the user in terms of how well they can do what they need to do in that tool. So I think if you just agree on that up front and you keep the user as the focal point, then a lot of the arguments are going to fall away.
Yeah, and Ned, on that front, we have some rules of thumb that we use on our team of things that we want our researchers to think about as they're deciding between high, medium, or low, so we can have some reasonable form of consistency. We won't always get consistency between researchers, but we want to have as much consistency as we can. So that's some more stuff that we plan to share. It's like, this is what works for us. People can take what our rules of thumb are and adapt those, use them as is, however they want. But we're happy to share that as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because I imagine, some people, you could theoretically goose your numbers a little bit and be like, oh my gosh, this person has a lot, or this organization has a lot. That makes sense. Great. Awesome. Looking forward to seeing that. And I understand there's like there's different statuses in how you're communicating this, using the recommendation adoption score. Communicated, committed. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes. So you saw in the formula that we had the communicated, which are the recommendations that have been delivered to the teams in some way, whether it's a report or a deck or whatever that may be. And then committed is something that's been scoped and resourced and is in the plan. And then adopted has made it into the product. So those are pretty clear. But as Brian talked about earlier, there are cases where a recommendation might be delivered and then there's just no room for that recommendation to be fixed for whatever reason, very valid reasons. Maybe there aren't resources. There's, been a decision at an executive level that that's not going to happen. So in those cases, both the researcher and the product owner would come to the agreement that it's best that gets canceled. And the reasons for that not making it to the product and being canceled are going to be tracked. There are going to be receipts along with that recommendation. And then it's agreed upon that that's not going to happen. So it's not something of potential value. Like there's not the potential for it to make it to the product. So we don't include it in the denominator. 2 other statuses could come up. So if there's a recommendation that's delivered and it's meaningful, but we already know it's going to be 6 months out before anyone gets to that. It's going to happen. It's just going to be a while. We can put the tag of deferred on that. So we know it's going to happen, but we know it's not like it's hanging there, ripening on the vine, waiting for someone to pick it. So we're not going to keep that in the denominator as well. But once we get to whatever time point it was that we said it should be deferred to, it needs to be readdressed and decided on, like, now are we canceling it? Now does it go back into the pool? Is it going to get scoped soon? Like, what's happening with that? So there is some degree of grooming that has to happen with your recommendations on a consistent basis. And so that also not in the denominator. And then finally, a recommendation that has, what's the other one? I'm forgetting what rejected. I'm sorry, canceled. So this situation is we created the recommendation. Everyone decided it was a good idea, but then boom, something came up. There's going to be a huge redesign of the product. That feature doesn't even exist anymore. The user's never going to have to go into that little, function. So it's not relevant. And so if that becomes an issue, then we just cancel the recommendation and we take it out of the eligible pool.
Great. Love that. Makes sense. Now, I'm going to move on. I'm just conscious a little bit of time. I've got some questions in the chat. I'm going to save those for the end and move on to how you've gone and implemented this without triggering a ton of resistance. As I imagine when you first do this, or when you first introduced it, your rating was poor, which is probably why you introduced it. You knew you had this sense, we need to track this. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah, we learned a lot from how we rolled this out, so you don't have to make our mistakes that we made. So we were so excited that we had our first set of data, said, hey, we're going to share this with the management team in one of the product areas. A lot of it was red. And, oh, yeah, you're right. It did not go well. There was a lot of, oh, my gosh, you're trying to make us look bad kind of sentiment. And so we quickly adapted and we kind of went undercover a little bit. So we adapted and said to our researchers, hey, let's make sure we all know what this is. Let's just talk to your product owner, because oftentimes the product owners that are on the ground that we work with, they really get it. They just want to make things better for their users. Their mindset is there. It's kind of when you move up the ladder a bit where the stakes get a little higher, where people get a little jumpy. And so we had our researchers just continue to engage with your stakeholders, explain to them what this is that we're tracking. Don't make a big deal out of it, but then just talk in terms, not in terms of RAS as the score, because once you say score, people start getting all score. Say, hey, we have a pool of recommendations. Let's just start working these. Let's just start taking them. Let's kind of review them every week, every 2 weeks, and let's kind of work through them. And lo and behold, we do it the next month. And our RAS, overall RAS across the products we're supporting would jump up a little bit. Next month, jump up a little bit. And maybe the next month it'd stay stable. It maybe go down a little bit, and then go back up again. But if we're looking at this across 18 months, it really moved from that low state. And we kind of naively thought, or I naively thought, that they would take this the way I would take it, that, hey, the lower your baseline, the easier it is to show improvement. That's not what happened. So, I would suggest it depends on the organization you're in. If you have a very advanced organization who can buy into this, then great, go full on. If you think, well, I'm not quite sure about this, I would suggest you track it yourself, but then speak in terms of recommendations and utilization, but keep that score to yourself. And then over time, when you get to a point where you can show, look where we're at now versus where we started, then they tend to be a little more receptive to that. It's like they forget about the, oh yeah, it was bad. They just want to focus on it's good now. And hey, whatever it takes. But that's one of the lessons that we have and how we rolled this out. And the other thing too that we try to communicate, and I think it works most of the time, is that we're interested in trends. So for RAS, we're interested in a 6-month trend, because you may, as a researcher, go off and do a great piece of research and come back with 20 recommendations. Well, that's like a snake trying to eat a goat. The team's not going to be able to act on that. So you're going to see your RAS dip. But if you look at it across 6 months, that's going to give you a better sense of what's going on. And when we have conversations with our stakeholders about this, it's more of a conversation. It's not, oh, this is terrible. We're just not going to support you anymore. It's like, no, that's not rational. But we have a conversation with them and talk about, well, where is all of this heading? The other thing too that I want to mention is around educating your team and other researchers, because at first we weren't getting a lot of uptake and there was some uncertainty on the team. And it really stemmed from our researchers thinking that they were being held accountable for the RAS of the products they were supporting. And I get it, because once you get a number and you put a color on it, people think that it's an assessment. Once we told them that, no, you're not being held accountable. You're being held accountable for your relationship with your stakeholders, understanding the problem, formulating good, valid research, doing great analysis, communicating effectively. That's your job. We are influencers. Today we do not do the code. We don't have development. We don't have prioritization process. So as long as you're doing that, that's what you need to do. And so those two things about how you roll it out and then making sure that your own team is bought into it and they understand that they're not being held accountable, because once you say you're being held accountable, weird things happen, right? People start to adapt and do strange things, and they modify the priorities and so forth. And so that's one of the lessons that we have from rolling this out.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, that was, that's the fear, right? It's like, well, I think you've got some measures. Well, it's important to measure it, because if you're not measuring it, then you can't improve it. But if I'm also being held personally liable to this thing, maybe I'm going to change this. I'm going to do a lot of low value things that are really easy for the PM team to bang out. Although you've got some breaks in there for that. Or maybe provide less recommendations, because it's going to give me a higher score. But good to know that you're not being judged on that. I've got a bunch of questions here. I've got some AI related ones I'm going to save more towards the end if we have time. I guess you go and get this score. You may be changing the trend over time over the course of 6 months. Where do you decide to, as you see these patterns emerge, where do you decide to invest? Is it in, more research effort and things that are likely to be adopted? Is it more in influencing the actual blockers to adoption? Like, how should people think about making that kind of trade-off?
Yeah, so on my team, in any team, we always have limited resources. And so where we put our researchers should be in places where what they're doing has the highest likelihood to result in some sort of action, right? Researchers feel better about themselves when they actually see something happen. And so I take, as a manager, as a leader, I take the RAS score and kind of look at, okay, this product currently has a certain RAS score. Let's just say it's in the fair range. But the trend, the 6-month trend, is going up. Okay, that's good. You may not be where you want to be, but you're trending in the right direction. That's great. I'm going to give you a green. I'm going to give you a continue. We're going to continue to invest in that product. Well, is that the only thing that I care about? No. So the second component of what I care about is, do we have what we call research velocity, or recommendation velocity happening? So do we have people in a place and they're sitting there and there's no new recommendations coming out of that space? Then I question and I go, okay, we've had you in there for a quarter, nothing new's coming out. That's going to be a stop. Okay, so when you have that recommendation velocity, stop, continue, caution. Same thing with RAS, start, stop, continue, caution. You sort of combine those. We have a table where we look at, okay, if this and this, and then we do this. And so I can look over many months for a particular product we're supported and go, gosh, you've been trending from continue to caution, now we're at stop. What is going on here? Right. So it forces a conversation. I don't just knee-jerk look at that data. go, I'm pulling my people, because there may be some mitigating things around that and why. And so we have those monthly conversations with the stakeholders. We have folks on our team who manage that relationship for us with the stakeholders, and we make sure they understand, and then they tell us what's going on with the stakeholders. So it's really a conversation, but we never would be able to have that conversation if we didn't have the score, we didn't have the trends, and we didn't have the information around. And my research ops person gets me that data around how many new recommendations did we create this last month, and how many of the last quarter, and what's the average number of research recommendations coming in for this quarter. So we use those two factors to decide, or to influence. It's a signal. It's a signal of what's going on. It's not the only signal, but it's one signal. And it's also a signal about how mature our UX organization is. And so one of the things you'll see in one of the upcoming articles is how could we map this data onto existing UX maturity models, like from NNG, and say, okay, they already have some criteria for those 6 phases or steps. What if we add this as another one? That's just another signal to say, where is your organization based on their ability to act on the things you're giving them?
That's great. So powerful, so powerful. And I love that it gets you out of that gut instinct. I don't think our research is going anywhere. I don't think it's being leveraged to, actually, we've got a measurable metric, and now we're pulling out. We've got better things to focus on. Teams that care about this, teams can actually go and impact this for whatever reasons. Either you care about it, or maybe you've got other priorities right now. That's fine, but we need to go and focus on things that are going to, because we're going to get worn out if our work is not being leveraged.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not, we're just pulling out indefinitely. It's like, we'll pull out for a quarter while you take care of the backlog we've already given you. And let's talk in another 2 months about where you're at. That's
great. And so, again, so powerful. If someone is listening here to this and they want to start tracking recommendation adoption tomorrow, what are the first steps they should take? What are the big breaks they should, avoid? How do you think about
that? Tammi.
So I am a distance runner, and oftentimes people who don't run approach me and say, how did you get there? Like, how do you start running like that? And my answer is always, you just go outside and you put one foot in front of the other and you start somewhere, right? So you keep it simple to start. You just got to start tracking recommendations. I think if you start with, let's focus on creating recommendations that are explicit and easy to track, that's the first step, right? The recommendations have to have that very actionable piece that can be tracked. And then you would also want to make sure that you have a set of defined statuses. So we have our statuses that we recommend, but if you have other statuses that you want to put into there, that's fine. I would just avoid in progress, because that's one of the most vague ways to track a recommendation. And then it's just do it consistently, right? Just like running, like just get out there and do it. And you have to have a process and a plan. So if you have that regular grooming, where on a consistent basis, you're entering your recommendations when a study finishes, you have an owner on that recommendation, and that those recommendations are being updated consistently to make sure that we know where the status is, that's how you get there. So once it's in place, I think it just becomes a much easier thing to do, but it feels overwhelming at first. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to produce this template to share with people, because Brian's team has tried different ways of doing it. They started with a Trello board. It got too overwhelming. Then they ended up going to just a simple Excel doc, and that worked with everybody. So we've taken that simplistic start to the Excel thing, and we've turned it into this template where you can just come in, plug your recommendations in, and it will auto calculate your RAS score. There's a place to provide like the velocity measure that Brian was talking about. And we have thresholds to help you decide if RAS is poor, fair, good, or great. We didn't talk about that right now, but it is something that is important for the RAS, because you got to know, like, what's the meaning to the number. And I do want to pause and say, if it's okay, I want to share something really fast.
Please.
We have related to the thresholds. That's in the article if you want to get in the weeds on that. But we also want to say that thresholds are individualistic to a team. So if you like our recommendations as a place to start for thresholds, great. But if your team is maybe less mature and the organization is less mature, maybe you are a little more lenient in your lines between what's fair versus good versus great. Or maybe you have an organization that's actually quite mature and you want to be a little more strict. That's fine too. But we also are trying to validate our threshold bands with researchers, product owners, designers. So we have a survey you can take that'll give you some hypothetical scenarios, and then you judge without knowing the RAS score. You're just going to judge, was this fair, poor, good, or great? And then we're going to take all that data and figure out what does when a person sees that scenario, what do they think? What's their reaction to where that's at, and see if it's matching the thresholds that we've created. So any data we can get around this is wonderful. We really want to validate. Please, please, please take the survey. So that's also awesome. You can find the QR link to that on LinkedIn as well.
And we'll make sure we share after this to everyone here and everyone that signed up the all this information, including the link to sign up, including Brian and Tammy's LinkedIn, so you'll be able to follow along for more of this stuff in the future. Cool. I'm conscious of time. We're wrapping up. I'm going to ask. We've got at least one question here. I think we've got a couple questions in here from the chat, and then I've got an AI question for you as well. From Jenny in the chat, how does the recommendation adoption score work with generative pre-product research? I'm interested in how we track impact from insights and focus on strategic direction. There's more distance between the research and the final product solution. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Jenny, you may have joined a little bit later than what I alluded to this earlier in the talk, where we had this question from our own researchers, right? They're doing evaluative, they're doing generative, they're doing all kinds of different research, and like, well, hey, I did this piece of research, strategic. It is informing where we should be going as a company in terms of maybe some features or whatever it might be. How do we validate that has actually been quote unquote fixed? And our response to that has been, if it gets into some sort of tangible strategic document or something that indicates that the business has adopted that, then we count that as fixed. It may not be something that actually has hit the glass, and maybe something that's influencing things that hit the glass, but that's where you in your organization can decide how you want to qualify something as fixed. That's what we do. So we want to make sure that we don't lose any of the outputs that are coming from our research, whether it's strategic, tactical, anything in between. That's how we handle those kinds of things.
That's awesome. And then from Vinathan, I think you kind of answered a little bit of this. Is the high value or low value gauge from users' inputs or stakeholders' opinions? And I think you kind of talked about high value is really based on user impact, but it's still subjective, right? Or it's going to be somewhat subjective. Yeah. Any additional commentary on that?
Do you want to take that one, Brian?
Oh,
sure. Yeah. So
everyone's hands off.
It is.
Yeah.
It's in no way. It's in no way influenced by our stakeholders. It is strictly done. That label is put on by the researcher because they know what's happened here. Now, we don't like to get to a report and just read out recommendations, because then people don't necessarily know where that came from. So literally, when we're reporting out recommendations, I ask my team to put in a table. Here's the finding, here's the insight, here's a recommendation. So you can see where that came from, so that anyone, when you're reporting it out, they go, oh, I see where you got that from. Now, in terms of the high, medium, or low, we do give some criteria to our researchers. So they have questions and things that they look at and go, okay, is it like this? Does it have this? Does it have this? And kind of like, it's a table. And if you have more checks in the high than you have in the medium or low, then we're like, okay, this is leaning towards a high. If you have more in the medium than the other two, this is leaning towards a medium. And so we're happy to share that with teams, and that helps us make it a little more objective, but we'll never get to fully objective. It's just the nature of the beast.
Makes sense. I'm curious, in the world of AI, final question, then we'll wrap up. In the age of AI, how is this going to change? And I think there's probably at least a couple of lenses I would think about this through. Oh, hey, Pat. A couple of lenses through. One is, insights can be produced now in hours by people running AI moderation sessions. And so a team this week I spoke to said that we've been we were lapped on a particular question by the AI. And so I'm curious, how do we think about tracking work of non-researchers here? And is that maybe that's not relevant for what they're generating? And is this purely a tool for research teams, or is it a tool for people who do research, or a tool for AI agents that are producing research? And the second is there also perhaps an opportunity for us to leverage AI to track this, to automate some of the stuff that you're working on, so that we're not having to, spreadsheets, we're able to get out of spreadsheets. So I'm curious, any thoughts on either of those topics?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the AI implementation of the tracking, absolutely. If you think about like these agents that are coming up, the MCP servers, there could be the potential to connect your Jira tickets to your Excel document and have, once you change the status in Jira, it just auto populates into your Excel doc. So absolutely, I think that one of the drawbacks to the manual system is like that, labor that has to go into the grooming process. So this is a place where I love the idea that AI could come in and help grease the wheels a little bit in terms of that process.
Yeah, in terms of the other question around, is this just for researchers? No, so it's for anyone who does research and creates recommendation. Now, what I'm really talking about is, we have a larger design org that has full stack design and research involved in it. So one of the things we're trying to do, because we never have enough researchers, is to upskill our designers so that they're able to run their own research. And as part of that, they will create recommendations. So it's all about, educating them on this entire process, make sure they write recommendations kind of the way we do. We have a structure to our recommendations, make sure they understand the grading, and then they have to put the stuff in. So, it's one of those things where if they're going to do the research, they kind of have to follow the same process we're following, because it really is an organizational metric around how is the design org, not just my team or whoever reporting this, because we have, and Tammy's on our data science and analytics team. We have folks who are expert in survey stuff. Everyone in our entire team is creating some sort of insider recommendation. So it's a total team kind of metric, not just for researchers. But we should be leading. We should be leading in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. The idea we can leverage this to help bring more rigor to the other people who are doing research. I think that's awesome, and I'm sure they'll embrace it. And I would love to see the delta in scores being achieved by people that are doing their research themselves and then having impact on delivery versus the research team, and then why, that then is going to lead to a bunch of interesting questions. Awesome. We're going to we're going to share a ton of other information after the fact, so you'll all get a lot of this here. I just want to say thank you so much, Brian and Tammi, for sharing this. This is awesome. I'm so pumped that this is out in the world and that we get to go and talk about it. Brian, we obviously caught up in Raleigh, late last year and got to talk a little bit about this. And like making this invisible gap between insights and action actually visible. That's rad. I'm going to drop your LinkedIn profiles in the chat, and then in the follow-up email, there's a template there that was mentioned, and I think that's got a bunch of definitions in there as well to help you go and figure out how to go and use this. And we'll share these two links to the Nielsen Norman Group article as well. But just want to say thanks. Thanks so much for sharing this stuff and putting it out there, and thanks everyone for participating.
Also, I saw your question in the chat where you said, is it RAS, RAS, or RAS?
What is it? Tell me.
Brian and I say RAS. I've heard other people say RAS, but like you say tomato, I say tomato. I say whatever you want it to be.
Right. But I felt like there was one of you said RAS and the other said RAS. Like there was a little difference there, even at one point.
Yeah. It's a northern and southern thing, maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Possibly. Yeah. But thank you, Ned, for having us, and thank you, Carly, for helping us get this up and running, and everybody else who was able to join. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Have a good one. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. You too. Bye.